There's one thing you do without thinking, dozens of times a day, that no other animal on this planet can do the same way. It isn't walking. It isn't using your hands. It isn't feeling emotions. It's this. Exactly this. What you're hearing right now. Words. It seems simple. It seems obvious. It seems like far too small a thing to matter this much. But think about it with me for a second. Before words, what was there? Before anyone could say danger, hunger, fear, fire, water, what exactly happened between two human beings who needed to communicate something urgent? And more than that, how does a living creature who has never heard a word, never watched anyone speak, who grew up in a world completely silent in terms of language, how does that creature arrive at some moment in history, at the point of opening its mouth and making a sound that means something? This is one of the oldest questions in science, and the answer, the closer you get to it, becomes stranger and more profoundly human. Before we get to how it happened, it's worth pausing to understand why it's so hard to study. Language doesn't fossilize. You can find bones hundreds of thousands of years old. You can find stone tools, cave paintings, fragments of pottery. But there is no physical record of a conversation. There is no piece of rock that holds the first time someone made a sound on purpose. That's why, for a very long time, the origin of language was treated as an almost forbidden question inside science. In 1866, the Linguistic Society of Paris officially banned any debate on the subject from its publications. Not because the question was wrong, but because the speculation was so abundant, so creative, and so impossible to verify that the debate had become unproductive. Think about that. One of the largest societies for the study of language in the world, simply declaring, this subject cannot be discussed here. And for nearly a century, that's exactly what happened. It was only in the second half of the 20th century, with advances in genetics, neuroscience, cognitive archaeology, and anthropology, that researchers began to find new tools to approach the question. And even so, to this day, there is no consensus, some of them very powerful. The first thing researchers had to settle was this. What's the difference between communication and language? Because communication is ancient, far more ancient than humans. Bees communicate the location of flowers through specific dances. Dolphins use unique whistles that function almost like individual names. Crows can pass information about predators to other crows. Chimpanzees use facial expressions, gestures, and vocalizations to transmit emotional states. But none of these systems is language in the way humans use it. The fundamental difference lies in something linguists call displacement. Human language lets you talk about things that aren't present, about the past, about the future, about places you've never visited, about beings who never existed, about completely abstract ideas, justice, hope, eternity, love. No known animal can do this systematically, and this capacity to speak about what isn't here in front of your eyes right now changed everything. Because when a human group can plan a hunt for tomorrow, discuss what happened last season, warn about a danger that exists somewhere far away, it gains an absurd evolutionary advantage over any group that can't. The question is, how did that capacity arise? There's a structure in the brain called Broca's area. It sits in the left hemisphere, in the frontal part of the cerebral cortex. And it's one of the regions most directly tied to the production of speech. When that area is damaged, by a stroke for example, a person loses the ability to organize words into sentences, even while they can still understand what others are saying. What's interesting is that primitive versions of this structure have been found in the fossilized skulls of Homo habilis, a species that lived roughly 2 million years. 2 million years. That doesn't mean Homo habilis spoke the way we do, but it suggests the neurological foundations for language began developing far earlier than most people imagine. At the same time, there's another crucial structure that humans have and other primates don't have in the same way. The larynx, positioned lower in the throat. In chimpanzees and gorillas, the larynx sits high, which lets them breathe and swallow at the same time. Practical for survival, but that high position severely limits the range of sounds they can produce. In humans, the larynx descended. It became more vulnerable. Technically, it's easier to choke when you eat. But in exchange, we gained the ability to produce dozens of different vowels and consonants. In other words, human anatomy was literally remodeled to allow speech. This didn't happen overnight, and nobody planned it. It was a gradual process across hundreds of thousands of years in which anatomical variations that allowed more complex communication were favored by natural selection, because individuals who could communicate better had a better chance of surviving and reproducing. But anatomy and neurology are only part of the story. There's a fascinating theory that proposes language didn't begin with the mouth. It began with the hands. The anthropologist Michael Corballis of the University of Auckland, along with other researchers, argues that human language evolved out of gesture. That before there were words, there were movements. The logic goes like this. The brain regions that control fine hand movements and the regions tied to language are anatomically very close and evolutionarily related. So-called mirror neurons, cells that fire both when you make a movement and when you watch someone else make it, are fundamental both to gestural imitation and to the acquisition of language. On top of that, chimpanzees can learn sign languages with a relatively large vocabulary, but they can't learn to speak, which suggests the gestural channel may be evolutionarily more primitive than the vocal one. The idea is that the first proto-humans developed increasingly elaborate systems of gesture, and at some point, vocal sounds began to accompany those gestures, initially as reinforcement, as emotional emphasis. Then, gradually, the sounds took over the leading role. It's why, even today, when people talk, they gesture, even on the phone, when nobody can see them. It's a behavior so deeply integrated that you almost can't separate the two. There's a date that shows up constantly in the research on language, roughly 70 to 100,000 years ago. That's when the archaeological record starts showing something different in human behavior. Cave paintings, personal ornaments, ritual burials, primitive musical instruments. The period became known as the revolution of modern behavior. And many researchers believe these behaviors are only possible with sophisticated symbolic language. You can't coordinate a burial ritual without being able to speak about death, about the beyond, about what the group believes. You can't create an ornament that signifies belonging to a tribe without having a word, or at least a symbol for that idea. But here's where an important divide opens up inside science. Some researchers, like the evolutionary psychologist Steven Pinker of Harvard, believe language emerged relatively quickly, perhaps as the result of one or a few genetic mutations that radically transformed human cognitive capacity. Others, like the linguist Daniel Everett, who spent decades studying the language of the Piraha, an indigenous people of the Amazon, believe language was not a biological leap, but a gradual cultural invention, that it was built over time, like any other human tool, and that its origins may be far older and far more fragmented than a single cognitive revolution suggests. It's a fascinating dispute, and it still hasn't been settled. What both sides agree on is that at some point in human history, something changed irreversibly. There's a gene called FOXP2. For a long time, it was called the language gene, which is an oversimplification, but an oversimplification pointing at something real. Mutations in FOXP2 cause severe difficulties in both producing and comprehending language. It's involved in the fine control of movements of the face, the mouth, and the larynx, the precise movements speech demands. The most intriguing part is that versions of this gene exist in other mammals, in rats, in mice, in songbirds. But the human version carries two specific mutations that don't appear in other primates. And when those human mutations were artificially inserted into mice, in an experiment published in 2009 in the journal Nature, the mice began producing vocalizations with different characteristics from other mice. It isn't language, but it's a staggering window onto how biology and speech are connected at levels we've barely begun to understand. Those two mutations in human FOXP2 appear to have become fixed in the population roughly 200,000 years ago.